insulin. Okay? They both impact glucose levels, but in the opposite direction. Now, if you eat a meal and your blood sugar level goes up, that's going to trigger release of insulin by beta cells. Insulin is going to cause activation of transmembrane proteins along the cell membrane of cells that allow them to pick up glucose and transport it across into the cell. So it's a type of facilitated transport. Okay. Now, once inside the cell, insulin promotes oxidation of glucose. It's breakdown for fuel. So we have energy. Okay. Now, so, and in fact, what insulin does is it promotes the breakdown for the immediate needs of the cells in the body. Once those needs are met, insulin is going to take that glucose and convert it to glycogen, which is stored within the liver and the skeletal muscle. Now, let's suppose you've had a particularly big meal that was carbohydrate rich, and you've filled all of your glycogen storage sites. Then what insulin does is take any additional glucose and convert it to fat or triglycerides, stored in adipose tissue. So you see a lot of insulin-dependent diabetics, if they're on a large dose of insulin, they tend to gain weight over time because of the stirred activity of insulin.
Isn't that why you have to change sites?
Oh, you have to change site because what's it called?
Something.
Lipotrophy is what it is. It's kind of a buildup of fat at the site of the injection.
But if they're storing it as fat, then wouldn't that mean that they're getting too much insulin?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to get unless you take insulin using a pump, it's hard to get just the proper balance. Yeah, that's the problem. So what happens when we eat a meal? This is 6 a.m., let's say this is noon, 6 p.m., that corresponds to breakfast, lunch, and supper. If our fasting sugar, let's say, is 100 milligrams per deciliter, well, when we eat a meal, what happens is our glucose levels increase and gradually come back down. Of course, following lunch, the same thing happens. The same thing happens following supper. So our glucose levels are kind of swinging up and down. The reason that the glucose levels come back down is because secretion of insulin typically mirrors secretion of the increase in glucose. So if the green curve here represents secretion of insulin, as glucose levels rise, so does production of insulin. And look what happens. As insulin levels go up, glucose levels fall down because that insulin is pushing glucose into cells. It's facilitating its uptake. And of course, as glucose levels come down, then so will the levels of insulin until the next meal. That's something that looks like this. Now, people who are diabetic are either type 1 or type 2. Type 1 is usually juvenile onset, okay, and it's associated with decreased production. Type 1 is usually due to an autoimmune disease where our immune system attacks those beta cells, destroys them, and so our ability to produce insulin is impaired. Whereas type 2 is more related to resistance of tissue to insulin that is being produced. So people who have type 1, oftentimes they have very labile control. Their sugars jump up and down. and it can be very difficult to control. If your diabetes is difficult to control, then management becomes a little bit more complex. So what these patients will do is they'll take a short-acting insulin and they'll inject themselves right before they eat breakfast, right before lunch, and right before supper, so that there'll be an increase in the insulin level that hopefully mirrors the increase in glucose. They're trying to reproduce what the pancreas should automatically, naturally do. Now, let's suppose you take your dose of insulin here, right before lunch, okay, and you don't eat something. It can happen sometimes is your glucose level will fall too low. You will become hypoglycemic, in which case then the alpha cells of the pancreas produce glucagon. Of course, glucagon is going to do the opposite. Instead of lowering blood sugar levels, it's going to increase. And the way glucagon does this is by two processes. By stimulating glycogen lysis, to break down glycogen into glucose, which gets released in the bloodstream, and by stimulating gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the conversion of non-glucose molecules into glucose.
And you said glucagon increases glucose levels?
It's going to increase glucose levels. Because when you break down glycogen into glucose, that gets released into the bloodstream. Gluconeogenesis is involved in converting non-glucose molecules into glucose. So our glucose levels are going to climb. In pharmacology class, we had a student, Lauren Perrin, who brought in a little boy,
Oh,
Chase.
it's so cool.
Yeah, who has an insulin pump. And she says he doesn't really get that many hypoglycemic episodes, but he has to carry around a glucagon syringe just in case. So that if at school he starts to feel tremulous, if his glucose levels fall too low, he injects himself
He injects himself?
with glucagon, yeah.
How old is he?
Oh, he's a little bit, he's like 12 or something.
He's been
Oh.
on since he was a kid.
I thought he was like
Yeah,
he's
smaller.
had-
Yeah, I'm thinking like a
But
toddler.
when we'd go to a restaurant or something, he'd sit there and they'd bring like a Coke instead of Diet Coke, and he'd be like, "This is not a Diet Coke, I have diabetes," and he'd like announce it to everyone.
He's actually a pretty good kid. He's pretty cool.
Yeah, he is. And they have a dog, a diabetes.
Yeah. The first one didn't work out, the second one.
Theirs was cheaper because they've got it in training. So they're like training there.
Oh.
But, you know, it's funny, as a result of this, Lauren Perrin is like an expert in diabetes.
Yeah,
She knows
is.
everything. When you or your child has some illness, you become an expert in that illness. So she was able to teach the class all about the insulin pumps. So she
Yeah,
knows-
because I knew, because the class before we went over diabetes, you and her had a conversation like about bringing Chase in, and I was sitting in there listening to y'all because I had to talk to you after, and I learned like a good amount just listening to her before you even taught the PowerPoint.
She's really knowledgeable. You know, earlier we talked about physiologic stresses. Hypoglycemia is a physiologic stress. In other words, it's going to induce activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Remember that we said with acute stress, sympathetic impulses travel down to the medulla and trigger release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So when that person becomes severely hypoglycemic, they may feel their heart racing. They may start to become sweaty. Why? Because sweat glands are innervated by sympathetic neurons. Okay. They may become tremulous. Okay. So all of these sympathetic symptoms are a sign to them that their sugar's too low and they need to do something. Now, at the same time, sympathetic neurons that provide innervation to beta-adrenergic cells in the liver are going to trigger glycogenolysis. All right, so you're going to start breaking down glycogen, releasing glucose into the bloodstream. But in the meantime, if you can get yourself some orange juice with sugar, you're going to feel better more quickly. If you give a patient with diabetes a beta blocker, you have to do so with caution, because that beta blocker is going to block all the manifestations of the hypoglycemia. It's going to block the tachycardia that would result. It's going to block, some of the peripheral symptoms, the tremulousness. So the patient may not be aware that they're hypoglycemic. It will also block the beta receptors that are responsible for glycogenolysis. So they may not recover from the hypoglycemia as quickly because they're not breaking down the glycogen. So you have to be very careful when you give a beta blocker to someone who's got diabetes. It may impair their recognition. It may impair their ability to recover.
Would you just try to avoid that and give them something else?
Yeah, but there's some diseases for which beta blockers are one of the few choices. Like if you have severe coronary artery disease, you're talking about 3 classes of drugs: nitrates, calcium channel blockers, and beta blockers. And as someone progresses, you usually go from one to the other to the other. And so sometimes you're in a corner where you have to make some decision. You have to bite the bullet, but do so with care. All right, so what I've done now, give me 5 minutes because I have a couple of more microscopes. And I'm putting slides, and what I want you to do is just